I got new headphones. The last ones, they look like earbuds. They're about this big, and and unfortunately, the earphone would stay inside my ear, but the cord would fall out all the time. I'd be listening to you guys. I'm like, where'd they go? Us old guys and technology, we're never going to get there.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well, I'd like to welcome you back to New Frontiers. Let me start with my favorite national columnist, Bob Robb. Bob Robb, welcome back to the New Frontiers program.
Always good to be with you.
And then who I call the Oracle. I've known him for many, many years. He's been helping me out on economics, but I think he literally is one of the better economists in our country, Elliot Pollack. Elliot, welcome.
Always good to be here.
And if you like a good history professor, Henry is one of the best history professors. You'll notice from his accent that he maybe has more of an international look, but nonetheless, Henry, welcome.
Hey, Paul. Good to see you guys. It's been a while.
It has. So we're going to do a little catching up, and the place where we're going to start our catching up is by focusing this particular episode on Trump's cabinet. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with Elon Musk, who has played an important role inside the Trump administration. Now, certainly he's not a member of his cabinet. He's a member of an independent committee that seems to be outside of government. But I want to start with Elon because I think in many respects, Trump owes his victory to Elon Musk. Now, Elon Musk had the group that was out doing Get Out the Vote, and I don't really know the effect that group had. They spent about $100 million, so I suspect it was a big effect. But I think what was even more important to Trump was this idea that one of our great inventor scientists, the kind of a Tony Stark of sorts, had come to endorse him and was talking about during the campaign how they were going to put a focus on cutting regulation and cutting government spending. Now, that committee is underway. He's teamed up with Vivek Ramaswamy. They're focused on building out a committee today. There's lots of questions about the structure, about whether or not they will have any real impact because they're outside of government, although it wouldn't be beyond them to do something along the lines of a War Powers Act, where you delegate the authority to what comes out of the committee to being measures that Trump could implement without Congress supporting it. Or Trump could just decide he was going to bypass Congress in that process. But either way, I think this is one of the big legacy issues that Trump could leave. To me, it's the most positive part of his agenda, because there's no doubt our deficit is problematic in this country. Our budgetary shortfalls are monumental. They need to be dealt with. But I also can attest to the idea that our regulations have gotten way out of sort. So I'd like to start our committee focused on that one particular topic. Bob, I'll let you go first on this one.
I'm doubtful about its ultimate success, either substantively or politically. What the two chairmen of the DOGE committee, as they have given it its acronym, have said as the strategy in a piece that they wrote for the Wall Street Journal, was to go through all the federal regulations and identify those that arguably are afoul of two recent Supreme Court decisions, one of which said that if a regulation has a large impact, there has to be some clear delegation of authority from Congress. The other of which said the courts were to show deference to regulatory agencies for their interpretation of the laws under which they operate. and of the group of regulations that this committee deems runs afoul of those two recent court decisions, they would be put on pause. They would be, in essence, suspended. And while the formal and lengthy process of actually rescinding the law under the Administration Procedures Act takes place, I'm highly skeptical that will withstand court scrutiny. And the Administrative Procedures Act, I think, is an excessively cumbersome process, but it's one that's tripped up the Obama administration, tripped up the first Trump administration, tripped up the Biden administration, and I just don't think this bypass of the Administrative Procedures Act is likely to occur. Politically, every person's excess regulation is someone else's essential protection of public health or safety or something else. And I think that the discovery will be that while there is wide support for reducing government regulation in the abstract, when you get down to specifics, it's going to be highly politically controversial. And I don't think that Trump has a stomach for that kind of controversy.
All right. So let's set aside the argument of whether or not they have the political stomach for it. It is possible through those acts to do something along the lines of the War Powers Act, I would suspect, meaning you go back to Congress, you make the committee, you formalize the committee, you formalize their recommendation, and you shortcut the ability for the administration to implement it with Congress giving its authority, meaning attempting to try to get Congress to buy in before you start to name the cuts seems to me to be higher likelihood of being successful than getting them to buy in when the actual cuts are proposed. Any thoughts on that, Bob?
Well, you do have the example of the military base closing commission process, in which Congress agreed to allow that process that you just described to occur, but retained the right of Congress to reject the recommendations. But if Congress didn't act, those base closures would go into effect. So instead of it requiring congressional action, congressional inaction could approve what the committee recommended. That is not what is being discussed. And I think with the scope, the wide scope that this committee has adopted for itself, I'm doubtful that even a Republican-controlled Senate and House would agree to relinquish in advance that much authority.
All right. Elliot, instead of having you focus on the politics of it, I'd love to hear just your thoughts about the economics of it.
Well, it's going to be interesting. There's so much fat in government, whether it's the military or it's welfare or it's just the regulatory costs, that it should be easy. But for every regulation, there's a power base that wants it. And those, the trouble with government doing this is that benefits are specific and costs are diffused. So every regulation, every welfare cut, everything in the military has a power base at one end, and will they be strong enough to overcome that power base? I agree with you that if they take it to Congress onesie-twosie, it's going to fail. And they have to basically have permission to just go about their business. The fat in the budget is almost all in welfare. And if you means-tested programs, it's not Medicare and Social Security that's the problem. It's these means-tested programs where people don't have to work. They paid people not to work, and as a result, people aren't working down in the lower two quintiles. Whether or not you can get away with that remains to be seen. Whether or not you can get the military bloat cut remains to be seen. But I think that essentially Americans, unless I misread the election, are going to cut him some slack because they just want to see something done. To get, a lot of money out of tariffs, it's going to be not a lot of money, but it'll be a good sum of money. And we'll talk about tariffs, so we'll get there. But it's got to be out of cuts. It's got to be, all right, we're changing the way we do things. And if that doesn't happen, then Trump will fail.
Yeah, it's a couple of things on your points, Elliot, that I think are important. The first one is from a military standpoint. I think that what Elon is focused on, instead of focusing on direct cuts, focusing on changing the technologies. I mean, there's no doubt we're spending millions of dollars on missiles to shoot down drones worth $50,000, right? We have to find a different way to approach that problem. His looking at planes that are pilotless. It's going to be very controversial. I got to fly with the triple nickel, and it was one of the great experiences of my life. And those pilots aren't going to like the idea of planes that fly themselves. But to me, that makes sense. That's logical. Looking at technological solutions so that we can maintain our preparedness. I also think it's important that when you're talking about the general public, there is a sense of when a new administration comes in that there's some hope that the goals that they had can be accomplished. And this is one of those goals. I actually agree with Bob. I think it is going to be incredibly difficult, both politically as well as administratively, to get it done. But I'm hoping they find a way. Now, it'll end up becoming the cannon fodder for the election 4 years from now. That's just a fact. But Trump isn't running for re-election 4 years from now. If they don't implement it, my guess is it becomes Vivek Ramaswamy's ability to run for office for president by saying, hey, I've got this plan, and this is the plan that I'm going to implement if I become president that we did during our period of time there. But
well, I think it's even more than that. I think this is the last chance to get it done.
I agree
Trump
with that.
And Musk can't get it done. Essentially, we continue to sort of walk down that slow path to Banana Republicville.
Yep. All right. Henry, any thoughts on this? We've had discussions about what have happened around the world on the issue of austerity. Any thoughts about how maybe this fits in internationally in terms of what you're seeing?
It's a good question. I think that what we're really discussing here is a question about the balance between structure and agency and reform. What Musk represents is an attempt to use an agent, just one person, and their personal agenda and their personal charisma and power to try and reform what is a very big, massive institutional structure, whether it's the military industrial complex, the welfare state, pensions. All of these things are huge institutional structures with so many vested interests, so many people benefiting from them, so many people depending on them. And the idea that you can have one person come in and reshape these big institutions to the degree that it meaningfully changes the structure of the federal government is a big ask. It's a really big ask for anyone, especially in a system like the United States, where you have so many veto players across multiple branches of government and even across the states. So I'm not saying that I don't think Elon Musk's going to get anything done. It's just that I'm not sure we're going to see a fundamental wholesale reform. It could be that some things come out of this that are really good, like, for example, and make a big difference. Like, for example, I always thought that for all his faults, that the corporate tax cuts that Donald Trump implemented during his time in office were good for the economy and generated economic growth, which was good for the poor, ironically, because it generated jobs. And it could be that we get some things out of this initiative that don't completely reform the federal government. We still have, most of the money going to Social Security, to Medicare, Medicaid, and to the military. But there's some sort of reforms come out of this, and reductions in regulations or things that are under a really strong centralized executive control that do generate good outcomes, maybe through time or through some sort of economic growth effect. That's my hope, right? Is that even though these big structures are very difficult to reform by one person, that maybe some good can come from this nonetheless.
All right. So, Henry, I'll start with you on this question. My own, I think your point is well taken. Elon Musk talks about cutting $2 trillion. Good God, if he cuts $1 trillion out of the budget, it's going to be fantastic. So if he hits his mark by 50%, I would be happy. There's a lot of discussion about what does Elon want? Why is he doing this? Why is he playing the role that he played with Trump? My own personal opinion is I'm a pretty big Elon fan, but I'm a fan because of the results that he's produced. He's done some pretty amazing things. Now, I am going to point out a criticism because I think this is important. This week, Colonel Vindman criticized Elon Musk because of his relationship with Putin. Elon Musk's response to that was to respond back that Colonel Vindman, who was involved in giving testimony against Trump during his impeachment trial, was going to be put up for treason. Now, the reason that I have a problem with that is that Elon is supposedly a big advocate of free speech. Well, there's nothing more important that you can do to squelch free speech than to have government telling people what they can and can't say. And whether Elon likes it or not, he's kind of become a part of the administration. And the idea that he could threaten someone with treason actually could end up being true, which would squelch their free speech. Now, that's my criticism of Elon, because I think that that's important. And I think Elon, hopefully somebody gets that through to him. That was way past the line of where he should be. But on the other hand, I think his motive here is simply to try to do good. It is simply to take on a monumental task, which is trying to reduce the federal budget and to try and help push that through. And my guess is that Elon isn't going to stop at just proposing cuts. When he gets them proposed, if he finds that he has a political problem of getting them implemented, he's going to look for a political way to get it done.
Musk is an interesting character. You know, he's taken on these sorts of challenges in different contexts. I remember a few years ago, there was a sort of a power outage somewhere in the state of South Australia, and Musk promised that if he was given a certain amount of money, he would build these batteries and solve the problem. And I believe that he did. So he's taken on all sorts of problems around the world, whether it's building the rockets or, building these car factories or building these sort of power plants. And he's had some success, but I'd say that he's mostly worked within the confines of the private sector and within his own companies where he has a lot more authority. He hasn't had to work through large government agencies, right? He's received grants from government agencies. He's collaborated with them on specific projects, but he hasn't had to actually propose reforms that go through government agencies like the Department of Defense or one of these other enormous federal bureaucracies. So I think it's a new challenge for him. He probably relishes the challenge. He seems like that kind of guy. I believe that he probably does want to cut spending from the federal government to a large degree because I think it corresponds with his basic philosophical commitments, right, around individual liberty and limited government. But what I'm going to be interested to see is how far he gets when he's confronted with these very, very different playing fields, whether it's the Department of Defense or the Social Security Administration or one of these other big federal bureaucracies, rather than a private company where he's the CEO, he can fire people, he can set directions much, much more immediately than he can in a very, very large, sprawling bureaucracy.
Yeah, I can tell you, and this is probably not the correct place to play this story out, but in 1990, we had to go through some major cuts in city government, and making some of those cuts resulted in some people at the government level. For the most part, most people were really good about it. They worked with us to get our way through it, but there were some nefarious things that definitely happened in that process. And it is amazing how smart some government workers can be to try to throw sticks in your spokes on the way there.
Well, I'm skeptical of his ability to drive a major reform in government overall, both because of the inherent difficulty of that job and also because he has no political skills whatsoever. And you need enormous political skills to succeed in the effort that he's undertaken. However, independent of the Musk committee, there will be an ongoing deregulatory effort by the Trump administration, about which I am much more optimistic, increasing the ability to produce fossil fuels, increasing the ability to export natural gas, lifting some of the regulatory burdens that constrain the private sector economy, either antitrust or security regulations or other things. I believe that going through the ordinary process, pursuing a deregulatory agenda, as Trump did in his first administration, is likely to produce potentially significant benefits and results.
Henry hit it on the nose, I think. Musk is now working in an environment that he's not used to working in. On the other hand, somehow he was able to compete with NASA and came out smelling like a rose. So who knows? But he's going to face things I don't think he ever faced in the private sector, and it's going to be interesting how he reacts to being attacked, because he certainly will be. But if like I said, he's probably the only guy who has a chance of doing this that I can think of.
I agree. All right. So, Elliot, I'm going to start with you on this one. One of the things that seems to be clear to me is that Trump is appointing people who end up being on both sides of the issue, or on opposite sides of the issue, maybe is a better way to approach that. And I'm going to give two examples. The first example is Kennedy with Rollins. Kennedy has made a big push to try to get rid of soybean, sugar, a whole variety of different things by taking over the USDA or having a bigger role in the USDA. Rollins, who was appointed from the America First Committee, worked in the first Trump administration, and is a big fan or big friend of farmers, and is going to lobby to keep those subsidies in place. They're definitely going to be working at different ends against one another. I see the same thing happening with our new labor secretary, Lori Chavez, DeReamer, I think is how you say her last name, but she's from Oregon. She's very, very liberal. She is, in many respects, very anti-business, at least from a labor standpoint. And that seems to me to be the exact opposite of where Elon is trying to go. What are your thoughts on that? How do you see that, the fact that you have these alternative points of views being put into place? And maybe more specifically, how do you see the new labor secretary?
Well, it's interesting because Kennedy and Rollins, I can see them at loggerheads, but they'll control each other, okay, essentially. But the labor secretary, she is very liberal, very pro-union, and she basically stands for everything that, as far as I can see, that Trump doesn't. And I'm not sure how that plays out. Maybe she won't last, or maybe, but I think that is. That's the one appointment that I really just didn't understand at all in terms of why he would do that. I have no comment on it other than everything she stands for is what he claims he doesn't, and I'm not sure how it plays out.
So, Bob, my view of why he did that is that what Trump is looking for is a great realignment. He's trying to realign the political sphere. And the way he's trying to realign the political sphere is moving labor out of the Democratic camp, or largely out of the Democratic camp, into the Republican camp. Now, part of that happens naturally. You go up into Pennsylvania and Michigan and you start talking to labor guys. Many of them are very religious and many of them are very pro-gun. So there were already social issues that drew them out of the Democratic Party. But I think he's trying to actually capture that, to make that part of the new Republican brand. Your thoughts?
I think certainly Trump's instinct is to try to attract more labor union support. And you saw that in the convention when you had a labor leader actually speak to the Republican convention in a prominent spot. There is also within the Trump world a movement towards a form of industrial policy and skepticism about the ability of the free market to deliver a just distribution of rewards, particularly for working men without a college education. Trump has never openly embraced the totality of that particular point of view and ideology. And so it's unsurprising to me that he would appoint a labor secretary who was enthusiastically responded to by the labor unions. The question is, will he support the PRO Act that the labor unions want, which would override the right to work laws in all the states, including here in Arizona, eliminate the secret ballot for approving union representation. So to me, the test isn't this particular appointee. It's what his legislative agenda is going to consist of, and whether he actually, as she does, will support the PRO Act. That will create a huge division within the Republican caucuses in Congress and among the red states, which is where most of the right to work laws exist and have been a competitive advantage for the red states in competing against the blue states.
There were definitely some comments that seemed indicative of Trump looking to oppose the right to work laws, which would be a dramatic departure for not only the Republican Party, but it would be a dramatic departure for states like Arizona. The idea that you have a right to be in a union, to me, ought to be a right that you have. That makes sense to me. But the idea that you have a right then to force someone else to be in a union that doesn't want to be in it doesn't seem to me to be fair.
Yeah, it's this interesting contradiction in a lot of this emerging nationalist ideology that we just see playing itself time and time again. We have, on the one hand, the traditional Republican rural constituency of farmers who want subsidies, but then on the other hand, we have this new emerging movement around healthy food, or so-called healthy food, which seems to mean organic agriculture, putting lots of restrictions on what farmers can and can't do. We see it with the labor agenda, on the one hand promising deregulation, but on the other hand promising to give the unions a freer hand to make it more difficult to do business. And you could say the same thing goes for the macroeconomic agenda, where you've got, on the one hand, wanting to reduce taxes, but on the other hand, wanting to increase tariffs, right? So there's going to be a lot of this type of contradiction, dissonance as we move forward. And to the extent that personnel as policy, we'll see people be jettisoned as one side of the agenda proves ascendant over the other. I personally would actually refer back to what I said a little while ago, which I think is one of Trump's most successful parts of his first term, which was the tax cuts for businesses. And I think that in the end, if there's kind of a roadblock on a lot of things because people are fighting each other within the administration, but a few big things are done, like, for example, extending the Trump corporate tax cuts and individual tax cuts, maybe even lowering the corporate tax rate even further, then maybe we get some sort of not so bad outcome, because something that has a big effect across the entire economy is implemented, whereas other things get stymied in this infighting among these people with very, very contradictory agendas.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you look at politics and political leaders, there really are kind of like multiple approaches. But one approach is that you apply to people horizontally. The other is you apply to them vertically. Horizontally would be a big, grand message that appeals to a large amount of people. Ronald Reagan's broad message was government's not the answer, government's the problem. Now, verticals are appealing to people based upon the silo that they're in. The idea that you go out and you appeal to women voters or to gay voters or to Christians or Jews. You segment people based upon their group that they're in, and then you try to appeal to them. It seems to me Trump has tried to do a little bit of each, but one of the things that's interesting is he seems to, like when we talk about this labor issue, he seems to appeal to what does the business community want most. Well, what the business community wants most is cutting regulations. And at the same time, then he goes to, well, what does Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Minnesota want? And the answer that they want is they hate globalization. So he gives them the tariffs, right? And all of a sudden, even though the business community hates tariffs, they don't hate tariffs as much as they hate regulations. And so they kind of stick with him on that issue. And on the other side, in those labor states, they're not big on cutting the size of government at the end of the day. They actually want more government in general. However, they're big on trying to eliminate globalization. And it seems to me he's trying to play both. Now, that brings me to another question. I am not big on, I think his name is Kesh Patel, which is the new nominee for the FBI director. He did some things when he was in the Department of Defense in the past that were pretty scurrilous. He's made outward comments about going after journalists who were a part of the Democratic movement to try to undermine them in January 6th. And I'm not certain if that's the reason that Joe Biden pardoned his son. I think the pardoning started actually earlier than that. But it seems to me that there's also a big discrepancy going on in the Democratic Party as Joe Biden is leaving through this pardon. The reason that it's so big is because he told us over and again that he wasn't going to do it. Bob, can you give me kind of thoughts on both of those, what you see going on in the Justice Department, the FBI, the appointments that are happening there, but at the same time, what Biden did with this recent pardoning of his son?
Well, one of the big questions was whether, with the Department of Justice and the FBI, Trump would simply try to do a reasonable job of clearing out some of the problems that have existed. And I think that there have been problems in politicalization of both entities, or whether he would try to turn them into a retaliatory arm for his revenge. And the early indications are not good. The appointment of Matt Getz initially as Attorney General and of Kesh Patel to head the FBI, I think raises legitimate concerns that he does want to turn it into an arm of vengeance rather than simply remove the politicalization that existed and return those entities into more of neutral law enforcement activities. I understand on a human level Biden's decision to pardon his son. And I do believe that there was a bit of trophy hunting that was done, that another person not famous in a similar circumstance would not have faced the plenty of enforcement efforts that were directed against Biden. And so I do believe that there was something there. Unfortunately, I believe this action clears the way politically for Trump to pardon the participants in the January 6th attempted insurrection. So while I understand it from a human standpoint, and even to a limited extent as an exercise of creating some better, just treatment of his son, I think its consequences for the country are going to be very bad because I think it makes inevitable that Trump will broadly pardon all of the insurrectionists on January 6th, some of whom have actually been convicted of sedition. That worries me.
Yeah, me too. And politically, I think if he was going to do it, he could have done it better. I mean, jointly pardon Trump at the same time. Find some way to say, hey, we need to start putting this political division behind us, which is very different than invading the Capitol. But the idea that someone's going to go after Trump at this point, it seems to me like that's counterproductive to the United States and the United States working well. Henry, I'd love to have your idea. You were talking a moment ago just about the concept of how these right-wing movements are working around the world. Certainly, I'd love to know your thoughts on Joe Biden's pardon, but I'd also like to know your thoughts on what just seems to be an attempt to alter the Justice Department in a way in which serves political means as opposed to trying to serve us justice.
Yeah, it's a big question. Democratic control of these types of institutions that have broad investigatory and powers of arrest, etc., like the FBI or the other intelligence agencies, is not simple, right? All countries, all sorts of regimes struggle to control these types of agencies, and they risk being politicized. And as Donald Trump complains that the FBI has become in the United States, but they also risk sort of just getting out of control, as some people would say that the FBI did under Hoover, and various intelligence and sort of secret police agencies have throughout history. And so there are different ways for governments to approach this. They install loyalists. It seems that's what Trump thinks he's doing with this chap Patel at the head of the FBI. Political economists will talk about the so-called loyalty competence trade-off, that you might have someone who's very good at a job, someone who's spent a long time, for example, at the FBI, but you might fear that they are too competent, too wedded to the institutional interests, and not as loyal to the president themselves. And so the president might replace them with someone who has less institutional competency. They're not as good an FBI officer, but they're very loyal to them. And it seems that Trump has decided to really maximize the loyalty to him over the competence within the agency. I don't think Patel has ever worked at the FBI or as a police officer, let alone an FBI agent. So this is Trump's approach to solving this problem. I think it is, in a way, a form of politicization of the agency to put a political loyalist instead of a career civil servant in charge. Although, of course, Trump would say, or his loyalists would say, well, the agency was already politicized, so this is a way to drag it back the other way. Those narratives will go on and on, probably for months, and never resolve themselves. But it is worrying when you pair it with things like Biden's pardoning of Hunter, which also seems to really push the boundaries of the norms of this type of behavior and politicization of the justice system. It's hard. I mean, I, for years, have been relatively skeptical of the idea that American democratic institutions, along with those in other developed countries, are decaying in a really fundamental way. But it's hard to escape the conclusion at this point that the democratic norms and institutions are being pushed to their limit and even beyond. One question I'd have for you and Rob and Elliot is there any way that this Biden pardon for Hunter is challenged in the courts? Because my impression is that, or from reading the news, is that it's unprecedented in its scope and duration. So I'd be interested to hear whether this is going to just get relitigated through the courts and this is going to go on and on.
There are some questions in terms of the limitations of pardons, but pretty much they're universal. I mean, maybe a question would be, could the president pardon himself? Certainly a president can't create a pardon for actions that you haven't taken yet, but I doubt seriously that there's any ability to overturn it. Bob, any thoughts on that?
The Constitution offers very plenary authority for pardons with no restrictions and no review or oversight. And particularly with this Supreme Court, I don't think that there would be any attempt to invent limitations that are not in the Constitution, and the Constitution grant of authority is untrammeled and unchecked.
Yeah, and the challenge for me is certainly I think that what Biden did, I definitely understand it as a parent. I was listening to some contractors who were very pro-Trump out at a job site the other day defending Biden for pardoning a son. It kind of blew my mind to listen to it, because I realized how out of touch sometimes I am with people at kind of the grassroots level. But it does violate, in my opinion, one of the norms that we have in our society that just says, look, there shouldn't be two sets of classes when it comes to the law. And this one makes it problematic. I think Bob's point was even more important, which is it lays out the headway or the beachhead to be able to go out and to pardon the other people who were involved in the insurrection. But my guess is when it comes to Kesh Patel, that the Senate is going to apply oversight to that one. You know, the one thing that you want as an elected official is you want to know that if you're being indicted, that you are being indicted or investigated based upon something you actually did wrong, not based upon somebody else giving the wink and a nudge to someone saying, that person's causing me a problem. There are Republicans who have differing ideas on a variety of pieces of legislation who are in the Senate that have to be thinking that if they appoint Patel, that they may become the target. It's not just Democrats. It will be Republicans. In fact, there will be no better way to ensure that you have order and obedience and that people are following the orthodoxy than the fear or the threat of an FBI investigation. It has the ability to destroy, even more importantly, more legitimate players. The less legitimate you are, Matt Gaetz, you almost couldn't hurt him by an FBI investigation. You're not going to hurt Donald Trump with an FBI investigation, but Joni, the senator in Iowa, you could hurt her. You would have an effect on her because when their reputations are reputations built upon following the law, all of a sudden somebody being investigated by the other side, even if it's totally bogus, can have a negative effect. All right, so Elliot, you can gladly comment on that, but I'd like to make a shift, if we can, to our new Treasury Secretary. I was interested with Bassett, and probably one of my starting points with Bassett that was fascinating is that this is a guy that didn't only work with Soros, but he was one of the masterminds behind some of his major moves that took place, including the bond issue that took place in England in the very beginning. The Republican Party for a long time has demonized Soros. I find it fascinating that the guy who's been appointed was kind of a right arm of Soros. Now, again, it doesn't bother me because I'm not bothered by the Koch brothers being involved any more or less than I was Soros being involved. I just don't care. My answer is people have a right to be involved in politics. The more transparent it is, the more I like it. But I don't really buy into the idea that there are boogeymen out there that are manipulating 100% of all public policy. Nonetheless, I'd love to have your ideas on Treasury Secretary Bassett, excuse me.
Well, it's interesting. If you look at his background, I came away with exactly what you came away with. He basically worked for Soros twice, and he raised money for, like I said, Gore and Hillary and Obama. But the only thing that he was a big supporter of the tax cuts, and he's an advocate for deregulation. And he basically contributed a bunch of money to Trump. So for whatever reason, his views of the world have changed, or else I misunderstood his views when he did all those things for the Democratic Party. But he is a guy who's going to try to push tax cuts. He's a guy who's going to be for and favor deregulation. He's going to want to, he understands Congress. Congress is going to want pay-fors. In other words, how are you going to pay for this? He'll negotiate it out. In that way, he's a lot like Trump, where you don't know exactly if he's going to do what he says because everything's a negotiation. And that's my take on this guy. He thinks that consumer prices can be brought down, and I agree. Although there was a really good article in the Wall Street Journal this morning about the effect of immigration, basically kicking people out of the country who are also in the construction industry, and how that plays out in terms of housing prices and whether you can get the houses that you need built. But overall, this guy has come from a place that I wouldn't have expected that Trump would like, but his positions over the past few years have been very pro-Trump in terms of what he wants and what Trump wants.
Bob, there are a couple of people, a number of people that have been appointed by Trump that I think are very good appointments. I think Marco Rubio was a very good appointment. I think his chief of staff was a very good appointment. And I would put Bassett in the category of Marco Rubio. I think you could argue or disagree with a variety of positions, but he doesn't have a criminal record. He's not, he hasn't been doing, a whole list of things that have been nefarious. He's a legitimate economic player and in fact, a very successful one. I would put him in that same category as Marco Rubio. Could you give me a comment on what you think about the good appointments that Trump has been making, or if you believe any exist?
I do. I probably would not include Rubio just because he has sold his soul to Trump, and Bassett is the same way. I mean, he went from being a tariff skeptic to saying they're good leverage to saying they're virtuous in their own right. But I do believe that Doug Burgum, as Secretary of Interior, is a very good choice. He's a bright, successful businessman, a successful politician. He understands the Western issues, and particularly with the need to reallocate shortages on the Colorado River and Arizona's stake in that. I find it reassuring that he will be at the helm of Interior. And there are others that, while I might disagree with them philosophically, are competent and qualified. And I believe most of them will be confirmed. I think that we can identify the ones that about which there's going to be problems and skepticism. An anti-vaccine zealot is head of Health and Human Resources, I think is a problem. Someone who has vowed to implement a vindictive, vengeful approach, I think is a suspect head of the FBI. I do think that there are those that are qualified, and I think as a standout would be Burgum for Interior.
All right. And so you mentioned tariffs. So let's stick with that concept for our closing here. There have been a lot of arguments on Donald Trump about whether or not he sees tariffs as simply a means to an end, meaning he utilizes them to negotiate something that he wants from groups, or whether or not he's a real believer in the tariffs themselves. And of course, if it's the former, then the idea is, well, tariffs probably won't be significant. They'll be utilized as leverage, but it won't be it won't become the major turning point for the United States and the rest of the world. If you believe in the latter, and he's going to implement massive tariffs, then my guess is there will be a dramatic changing. We talked about this in the last episode about winners and losers that come from tariffs. But your thoughts, especially after what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, where he began to threaten both Canada and Mexico and through China, and seemed gratuitously because he dropped the price of the tariff from 60% to 10% for them. I wasn't certain if that was an accident or if it was, I don't know why he threw that in. But nonetheless, on tariffs in general, what are your thoughts?
During his first term, tariffs were an implement of leverage. He views balance of trade as a scoreboard. And if you have a trade deficit, then you're losing. And so I do believe it was used. And his trade representative was Robert Lighthizer, who wrote a very good book about the Trump trade agenda. And what was attempted and why it was attempted during the first administration. And it was very much to try to get to the point of reciprocal tariffs, where we were on a level playing field with our trading partners. My own belief is that Trump's own views about tariffs have evolved. And I think he now believes in tariffs as a protectionist measure that's virtuous in its own right. He obviously still sees them as leverage. There was no attempt with Canada and Mexico to say, I'm imposing these tariffs until you reduce your tariffs for American goods. It was, I'm imposing these tariffs until you do something more about drugs and migration. So clearly those were leverage tariffs. But I believe he now believes, as was the policy of the United States in the 1820s through the 1840s, that protectionism is a virtue in and of itself, irrespective of what it does to our relationship with other trading partners, and that it's no longer just leverage. It's something that is a policy that he believes in and of itself.
All right, Henry, let's just suppose, and I think this is probably pretty close to being accurate, that we're going to have substantial tariffs that are going to be imposed by the United States. What do you think the effect of that really is around the world, and where do you think this ends up going?
Good question, Paul. I think that the economic kind of theory or debate has been settled on tariffs for hundreds of years that they are bad for the economy, right? They slow growth. You can't sort of game the system by imposing tariffs on imports and protecting your own industries while exporting to other countries. It doesn't actually help your own economy at all. So that's the economic theory. But we've moved into a world since 2016 or maybe a little before that doesn't really seem to matter. And economic expertise and orthodoxy has gone out the window. And so countries are kind of spinning off into their own regional or even individual national trading regimes. And that's going to be accelerated by what Trump is proposing. We already see the European Union getting ready to impose more tariffs on American products. The Chinese will, I'm sure, be preparing to do the same and trying to drag other countries into their orbit as they do so. Russia is, of course, completely isolated from the international economy through the Ukraine war. And so we're just going to see this general sort of distribution of regionalism and nationalism into the global trade system, and things are just going to become generally less aggregated. One thing that I think is really fascinating is about the timing of what's happening. I think at most periods in world history, America would be doing an act of great self harm, and the rest of the world would sort of just turn its back on America, especially with a rising power like China that plays such a major role in the international trade system. But if you look at global economies, they're really weak at the moment outside of the United States. The European economies are in an incredibly bad shape. They have huge deficits. They have low growth. The German auto industry, on which much of European growth depends, is completely in disarray. The British economy is in a profound productivity crisis, and through Brexit, even the City of London is in a crisis. The Chinese economy seems to be moving towards a sort of a low growth equilibrium. Growth rates there have been declining for about a decade, and it's further insulating itself from the world economy and from its previous model as the sort of manufacturing hub for the world. And so I think the United States could end up coming out through this period of nationalization and deglobalization looking pretty strong. But the question is that a function of American strength or a function of weakness elsewhere? And would America not do better to try and influence the global trade system in a different way, in a more open way that it might have a lot of control over, but still doesn't lead to this total fragmentation of a breakdown of the global trade system? So I think we're moving into a new era of a very fragmented, deglobalizing world that we haven't seen for a long time, since basically the aftermath of World War One and into the Great Depression is the last time we saw the world starting to spin into these regional and national trading units. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
So, Elliot, I'm going to end with you on this, and here's my question for you, and it's broad. So, I've had a lot of people who've asked me about tariffs, and of course, I'm not an economist. I just listen to economists like you. My read of them is I agree with Henry. I think that they have a very bad international effect. And I think that for Western liberal democracies, this is going to be more of a problem. It's going to create more regionalism, which benefit the Russias and China of the world. I agree with Bob that Trump has become a real believer in them. I do think, though, that there are upsides and downsides to tariffs. That just to look at them and say that they're bad economically is the wrong way to look at them. There are winners and losers that come out of a tariff world. First, I'd like to know your opinion on that. And the second thing that I'd like to know is if you were advising the average person who was watching, maybe a young person today watching, what would be the advice that you would give them in the event that tariffs are coming? I mean, my advice to most of the young people that I know is it's really a good time to buy a home. Get yourself into assets. But nonetheless, I'd love to know your thought on that.
I would definitely agree with that. But I still believe, despite what I've heard today, that Trump is a deal maker, and this is all positioning, and that what will come out of this are things that will strengthen the United States position with Mexico and with Canada. And he's not even president yet, and they're basically knocking at his door saying, hey, let's resolve this. So he's going to get what he wants pretty much. That's pretty obvious. Also, there was a little article in the Wall Street Journal this morning about China no longer sending us the minerals that we need for chips. So that game's already started. And China has been basically the overproducing for years, and they've been dumping that stuff on the rest of the world, especially here. And I think that's going to end. We've been basically sending them the money that geopolitically is going to cause us headaches down the road in terms of the road and belt initiatives, in terms of their spending on defense, all these things we're paying for. And the other things they're doing is they're coming here and they're buying the U.S. They're buying corporations. And then all of a sudden, those corporations end up with production in China. They basically are buying farmland. They're buying a lot of things that you don't want an adversary to have. And I think that Trump will use the tariffs, especially against them, to make sure that ends. Is it going to affect other people? He's an America First guy, and to the extent that he thinks they're hurting America, he's going to hurt them. But I think a lot of people are going to be willing to negotiate. I do not take the 20% tariffs and the 60% tariffs on China. I don't take that at face value at all. This is all a negotiating position.
Okay, so answer one last question for me, and this is a hypothetical. Hypothetically, if in fact you found that was wrong, or if you were projecting that was wrong, how about that? If we were projecting that was wrong, and he actually was going to impose a 10% tariff, the only question I would ask you is not is it good or bad, what advice would you give businesses or individuals to do to help prepare for that?
Well, essentially, I'd check their supply chains and see if they can make sure they have secondary supply chains in other countries where perhaps tariffs are going to be a little different. But essentially, higher tariffs will create a one-time jump in prices for a particular product. It's not going to be like going up annually. It's a one-time shot, and you better be prepared for that and your supply chain. On the other hand, if you can get Canada to send over more steel and more wood for home building, there's going to be a trade-off there. If Mexico actually does something about closing the border and trying to deal with fentanyl, although the Mexican president had a good point, essentially it's America that uses a fentanyl, so it's two-way street. There's a chance that it works out. But if it's just tariffs for tariff's sake, that's going to hurt everybody.
Okay. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. We appreciate you being on here. We come back in 2 weeks, and I have no doubt he'll give us a whole bunch more to talk about by then. With that, thank you very much, and thanks for being part of the New Frontiers.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great to see you guys.
Great to be with you.
Guys, thanks. That was a great discussion, guys. I appreciate it.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.